thank you all for attending this morning's briefing on Ferguson and beyond, profiling in America. The tragic events in Ferguson, Missouri have highlighted the need for systemic reform, not only in Ferguson, not only in Sanford, Florida, but nationwide, to ensure that all communities, regardless of race, are served and protected equally. Our knowledgeable panel of experts from the civil and human rights community, law enforcement, and academia will explore the ways to end profiling practices, including passing the End Racial Profiling Act and calling on the Justice Department to issue revised guidance of the use of race in federal law enforcement. And as some of you may know, we not only want that revised guidance that hasn't been updated since 2003, we want that guidance to attach non-discrimination provisions to any jurisdiction that receives federal funds. I just want to take a moment to say that the ACLU has had a long presence in the St. Louis area, and we've been actively involved on the ground since Michael Brown was fatally shot on August 9th. We filed 2 state Sunshine Act lawsuits to secure the release of the incident report involving the shooting of Michael Brown by Officer Wilson. After 3 weeks of agitation by the ACLU, the community, and Mr. Crump, the lawyers for the Brown family, we were able to receive a heavily redacted copy of the incident report, but that is still very unsatisfactory. We had to file 2 First Amendment lawsuits, one to challenge the policy of police ordering members of the media and public to stop the recording the police, and that suit is a suit that we won. I mean, really, the police were arresting people and arresting journalists for recording the events on the street of Ferguson. That can't be in a free society. And then we lost the other suit, which was to stop the police from ordering to keep people moving on the sidewalks, on thoroughfares, unless they were gathered in a designated protest area. So still, even though people think that the free press issues are over, they are not. We also filed suit to have an officer removed who you saw on national television who pointed an assault weapon toward civilians, threatening to kill them. That officer was removed from duty. And then finally, when Governor Jay Nixon declared a state of emergency, the ACLU, along with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, released a statement expressing civil liberties concerns about the curfew, and the next day, the governor rescinded the curfew. Before Ferguson even jumped off, 2 months before, we were able to issue a groundbreaking report called War Comes Home, the Excessive Militarization of American Policing. And the author of that report is in the audience, Kara Dansky, if you would stand up. That report has been used by civil rights leaders all over the country. And you can find that report at aclu.org and online. You can also find our report on marijuana arrests, which shows deep racial profiling in those arrests. Hillary, come up and join us.
You always worth waiting for.
You're worth waiting for, too. So I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to introduce our hosts today and the distinguished members of Congress who are here. First, I want to introduce Senator Ben Cardin from my home state of Maryland. Would you stand up, Senator Cardin? He has been the consistent leader on the End Racial Profiling Act, a law that many of us helped to write that would end racial profiling in the federal government. And Maryland has a unique history with this issue because the ACLU brought the Driving While Black case, which was a case where African Americans and people of color were pulled aside on the highway I-95. And Senator Cardin has been very supportive of that litigation. Last Friday, he was able to go to the investiture of DC Circuit Judge Robert Wilkins, who was an African-American man whose family had to stop and pull all of his belongings out of his car while drug-sniffing dogs searched his car. And now Robert Wilkins, our former plaintiff, is on the D.C. Circuit. But the work of that Maryland case is still not over after all of these years, and that case was brought in the 90s. So Senator Cardin, with his staff, Bill Van Horn, have made this briefing possible, and he went on the floor last week and gave a profound statement on the need to end the scourge of racial profiling. Our other co-sponsor has not yet arrived. He's John Conyers from the state of Michigan. Everybody knows John Conyers if you care about justice. And he's the ranking minority member of the House Judiciary Committee, but we prefer to call him chairman. He has been equally engaged in the issue of racial profiling all across America. But I'd also like to introduce Congressman Bobby Scott from the 3rd District of Virginia. Congressman Bobby Scott is a pivotal leader on the House Judiciary Committee. Would you just stand so that we can acknowledge you? He's the former chairman of the Crime Subcommittee, and now he's the ranking subcommittee member, and we hope that he will be the ranking member on the Education and Labor Committee in the House of Representatives. So we look forward to working with both Senator Cardin and both Congressman Scott and Congressman Conyers on this issue as we move into the 114th Congress. Now I would like to introduce another leader in civil rights who probably needs no introduction. He's quickly becoming the 101st Senator, Hillary Shelton. He's the director of the National Association for Advancement of Colored People's Washington Bureau and senior vice president for advocacy and policy. And the leaders of the NAACP may change, but Hillary is our constant. And he's responsible for federal public policy for the nation's oldest, largest, and most widely recognized civil rights organization in the United States. The ACLU was established a few years after the NAACP, and in some places they were formed in the same household under threat of punishment by the state governments. So anyway, Hillary is my co-chair on the Crime Task Force of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. And so I thought what we'd do is just go in order and allow everyone to have brief opening remarks, and then we will open the floor up for questions. And you may remain seated if you like, or would you prefer to stand? Okay. I didn't hear you. Oh, I'm so sorry, Senator Cardin. This is your party.
Laura, first of all, let me have Bobby Scott come up with me. Bobby, come on up here, because I want to get the two of us up here together. Bobby Scott, and I want to correct one thing that Laura said. I love Laura. She does an incredible job for us. She's a Marylander. We appreciate everything she does every day. But you made one mistake, and that is we are not hoping that Bobby Scott is the ranking member. We hope he's the chairman of that committee. Let's get the terminology straight. And I want to get to Hillary and the panel as quickly as possible, so I'll be very brief. And for a senator to be very brief, please don't tell my colleagues. First, thank you all for being here. And I appreciate that we have a lot of distinguished people here. Nancy Sirkin, the leadership role that she plays for the conference. Reverend Yuri from Baltimore, appreciate you being here and everything that you have done on behalf of civil rights. And how many more Michael Browns will we have? They're going to lose their life. How many more Trayvon Martins? We all know that profiling is un-American and wrong. We know that. We also know it's a waste of resources, that police are wasting their valuable resources when they do profiling rather than doing good police work. We know it turns communities against law enforcement, where they need to work together in order to be the most effective. But we also know it's deadly. It's causing loss of life. And therefore, it's got to end. I'm proud to partner with Congressman Conyers and Congressman Bobby Scott on the end of Racial Profiling Act. We filed that bill, by the way, before Trayvon Martin. And it's gotten new life, and one of the reasons I'm so pleased that you're all here today is that we need a strategy to move it forward, to make it law. The bill that I filed with Congressman Conyers and Scott would have legislative action. We want the Department of Justice to take action. And Attorney General Holder's moving on ending profiling by what he can do by executive order. And I also hope he'll revisit the supplying of military equipment to local law enforcement, which has been abused and can intimidate the rights of First Amendments in our community. All that needs to be revisited, but we need to pass legislation that once and for all says that profiling is wrong, and we define profiling. Profiling is not using specific information about a particular crime. It's when you target a person or investigation because of race, religion, national origin. That is outlawed at any level of government, federal, state, local. We provide resources for training and best practices. We make it clear that we won't tolerate this, and we have the Attorney General making reports to us as to what is happening in our community. That's what we need to do. We need to pass that legislation. I hope today that you will have the opportunity to develop the strategies so that we can get some action in this Congress. Let's not give up. Remember, this is still September. We have 3 months, 4 months before this Congress ends. Let's get some action in this Congress. And I know we have a lot of friends on the Judiciary Committees on both the House and the Senate. Let's use that. Let me just conclude by quoting one of the witnesses that was at our hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee, and that is Ronald Davis, the Chief of Police of the East Palo Alto, California. He said, "There exists no national standardized definition for racial profiling that prohibits all users of race, national origin, or religion except when describing a person. Consequently, many state and local police define racial profiling as using race as the sole basis for a stop or any political action. This definition is misleading in that it suggests using race as a factor for anything other than a description is justified, which is not. Simply put, race as a descriptor, not a predictor, to use race along with any salient descriptors when describing someone who has just committed a crime is appropriate. However, when we deem a person to be suspicious or attach criminality to a person because of color of his or her skin, the neighborhood they are walking in, or the clothes they are wearing, we are attempting to predict criminality. The problem is with such predictions is that they are seldom right in our results and are always wrong in its approach. We're here today so we can take action collectively. I'm glad that you mentioned Judge Wilkins' elevation to the D.C. Court of Appeals. He was the plaintiff in the lawsuit against the state police. He was stopped solely because of his race, coming home from a funeral. And the only reason he was stopped was his race. He had enough courage to step forward and to bring action against the very powerful Maryland State Police. It resulted in a consent order that became the model for the nation. He is now sitting on the United States District Court of Appeals. Chief Justice Roberts was at the investiture. Yes, we've made progress, but we still have a lot of progress to go. And I thank you all for being here because you give me great confidence that we will adopt the right policies for this country so that we truly can be a land that provides opportunity for all and that does not discriminate. And let me turn to my colleague from the House, Bobby Scott.
Thank you, Ben, and members of the House do know how to be brief. The Senator has outlined why racial profiling is wrong and doesn't work, and we need to take advantage of every opportunity to do something about it. We've got great witnesses. We're going to take advantage of the Trayvon Martin and the Ferguson situation to focus on this issue and many other issues in the criminal justice system. So, Ben, thank you for hosting us. Thank the ACLU and NAACP for convening us. Thank you.
Hillary, it's up to you.
Good morning, and thank you, Senator Cardin and Congressman Scott, and in his absence at this point, Congressman Conyers for their great leadership on this issue. As I mentioned, I'm Hillary Shelton, Director of the NAACP's Washington Bureau, and serve as Senior Vice President for Policy and Advocacy. This panel today here on Capitol Hill briefing entitled Ferguson and Beyond, Profiling in America is our discussion for today. But I want to let you know who our discussants are. quite frankly, leading this charge and hearing from these experts in this area is extremely important. What we're going to do is I'm just going to introduce them first. After the introductions, bring them up one by one for just a 2 to 3 minute opening. Then we're going to get into some conversation and get to a point where you can ask some questions as well. An amen to that? Amen. Thank you, brother. All right. Teasing. Moving right along. As you know, this briefing is actually being presented by the ACLU. You heard from Laura Murphy, my good friend, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights these days, Wade Henderson, who is not here at this moment, which we'll be stopping through in a little bit, but Nancy Zirkin is, and we'll be hearing from her towards the end of this briefing, as well as our good friends from SALT, who are not able to make it, quite frankly. As a matter of fact, our good friend Suman Raghunathan was supposed to be here from SALT. She is one of those tens of thousands that are now stuck on Amtrak trying to get in from the north. As you heard, the power lines fell, the train tracks are not working. Some people seem to know about that and are smiling in an all too personal way, I think. But nonetheless, she was not able to join us, but is part of our coalition as well. Let me tell you who our presenters are today. Our first presenter comes to us from Tallahassee, Florida. He's an accomplished attorney who represents the families of, sadly, Martin Lee Anderson, Trayvon Martin, Robbie Tolan, and most recently, Michael Brown. It's our goal to, as a matter of fact, it is quite frankly our goal in meetings like this to actually put him out of business. No misdeed intended. Nonetheless, brother, we just as well we could have you doing probate or something. But so, nonetheless, ladies and gentlemen, he is an expert in this area, probably too actively involved at all in this science, but he's a good friend of ours, Benjamin Crump. Give him a hand. Our next speaker is Chief of Police for Petersburg, Virginia, Police Department for 7 years now. He also serves the Richmond, Virginia community for over 24 years, having reached the rank of major with the City of Richmond Police Department. He most recently had the honor of serving as president of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, or NOBLE, as many of us know him. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big hand to Chief John Dixon III. Our next guest is an assistant professor for the social psychology department at the University of California, Los Angeles. He's also co-founder and current vice president of the Consortium for Police Leadership and Equity. He is an acknowledged expert in the contemporary forms of racial bias and discrimination, as well as the intersections of race and gender. We call upon him all the time. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big hand to Dr. Philip A. Goff. Our final panelist today has since 2006 been the legal director for the ACLU in my home state of Missouri, by the way. Following the St. Louis County and the Ferguson Police Department's initial denials of requests to turn over incident reports from the August 9th fatal shooting of Michael Brown, the ACLU of Missouri filed 2 Missouri Sunshine lawsuits to receive copies of the incident reports from the St. Louis County Police Department and the Ferguson Police Department, which could be contained. Important details regarding the shooting and are key to the fair and just investigation. While the 2 departments have now each sent over their incident reports, both are heavily lacking in information and heavily redacted, demonstrating the continued and troubled lack of transparency. The ACLU of Missouri has also filed 2 other lawsuits related to the protests. The first challenges the restrictions on the use of photography, and the second challenges the requirement of protesters not standing still on the sidewalk. They told them to protest, you gotta keep moving. Nonetheless, ladies and gentlemen, please give a big hand to Tony Rother. So I'm gonna ask our first speaker, Mr. Crump, to come up and open things up for just a couple minutes, and we'll move on from there. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big hand to Ben Crump.
Thank you, Hillary. Telling a trial lawyer who was brought up in a Baptist church that he has 3 minutes is quite a challenge, but I will try to follow your request. I come with a heavy heart thinking about Michael Brown and the recent developments in Ferguson just this morning, Laura, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in the question and answer session. But I first want to say thank you to Senator Cardin, Representative Conyers, my good friend and colleague, Congressman Scott, And Laura, we are so appreciative of your leadership in doing this today and what you and Mr. Roberts did with us in Ferguson to protect the people who came out to express their First Amendment rights. So I want to touch on three things just briefly, and then we'll have our discussion. The first thing is really Ferguson, Mr. Robert. And it's bad when you racially profile our children, and I'm going to talk about that with Trayvon. But then it's equally worse when you just profile everybody blatantly. What do I mean by that? Those who came out for Officer Darren Wilson, the shooter, they were recognized as supporters. But those who came out as supporters for Michael Brown Jr., the dead kid on the street who had been out there for almost 5 hours in the baking sun, Congressman Scott, they were recognized as protesters. Those who exercised their First Amendment rights to support Officer Darren Wilson were given police protection. Those who exercised their First Amendment rights to support Michael Brown Jr., the kid who had been shot, was called protesters. And they were greeted with police enforcement. You understand? Police protection and police enforcement. And then Hillary, after he shot at least 6 times, maybe more, we don't know yet, this unarmed kid who put his hands up, 7 witnesses now have said it, he put his hands up. They were very clear about it, 7 witnesses. Shot him multiple times. The kill shot in the top of his head. He was ushered out of the Canfield community in Ferguson, Laura, under peace and resolution that he would be afforded all his constitutional rights of innocent until proven guilty as they ushered in tear gas and rubber bullets and riot gear and tried to steal away the constitutional rights of the dead kid on the ground while they attempted to assassinate his character, even filing a lawsuit to get his juvenile records as if this would somehow justify him executing this kid in broad daylight. And so, as I said many times with Trayvon Martin, it was bad that his killer profiled him, but it was worse that the system profiled him. And yet we see the same thing happening years later in Michael Brown's case. Now, just a point about Trayvon Martin and Hillary, I'm trying to be brief. You know, his killer profiled him. He pursued him. After he profiled him and shot him in the chest. And we heard the 911 tape. The police came, and then they profiled Trayvon Martin lying on the sidewalk in the gated community with the hole in his hoodie. How did they profile him? They took his killer's word. They took his killer's word that he was nothing but a little thug criminal looking to break in somebody's house. Didn't even go knocking on all the doors to see if this was somebody's child. But even worse than that is that our entire system of criminal justice profiled Trayvon Martin. How did they profile him? When, during the trial of his killer, the lawyer attempted to say because there was a young African-American who had previously burglarized a home in that community many months before, that this somehow gave Trayvon's killer a license to stop and detain every young person of color who happened to come into that gated community. It is bad when these killers profile our children. It is worse when the system profile our children. And then lastly, I heard Laura and the senator talk about Judge Robert Wilkerson and what happened in Maryland, where recently the U.S. Supreme Court, Hillary, returned a unanimous decision in the matter of Robbie Tolan down in Houston, Texas, what I am calling now 20 years after Robert Wilkerson's case, the prima facie driving while black case. And I'll quickly tell you the facts of this case. His father was a great baseball legend, Bobby Tolan. Some of you sports fans may know him. Played for the Big Red Machine, won some World Series. Robbie Tolan lived in an exclusive community called Bel Air, Texas, where his son on New Year's Eve 2008 with his cousin went to the Jack in the Box, was riding home with their food. The police officer saw him riding through a suburb that is predominantly white, and for whatever reason, made a decision that, like Trayvon, made a decision that something ain't right about a young black person being in this gated community or this suburb. And so he turned around. By the time he flipped his squad car around, Robbie was turning on the street, went into his front yard, Congressman Scott. They were getting out the car. Him and his cousin get the food out. The officer jump out the car with his flashlight and his gun, say, get them on the ground. And what makes it so bad, Attorney Briggs, is he ran the tag. He put the tag number in wrong. It came back stolen. It said verify. And what the police experts say you're supposed to do is call it in verbally while you're looking at the tag and say what the tag is so we can make sure this really is a stolen vehicle. Well, he didn't do that. He just jumped out with his gun in his car and was yelling at the boys. And the boys, these two young men, 21 and 20, Robbie's a minor league professional baseball player, said, man, this is our house. We ain't did nothing. The commotion caused his mother and father, who were in their bed at 2 in the morning, to wake up and run out the house. His mother, her testimony, Congressman Scott, that she came out in her nightgown exposing herself because that was her only child. And she knew a police officer and a young black man yelling at one another, it don't end well for the young black man. And so Bobby Tolan, this baseball legend, runs out in his T-shirt and underwear and tells them, hold on, you made a mistake. This is my son, this is our house, this is our car. His wife does the same thing. And what does the young white police officer do to Mr. Tolan, who he just saw run out his house? It reminds you of Skip Gates. I mean, just saw him run out his house. He puts him spread eagle against the squad car, at gunpoint. His sergeant comes on the scene, and he sees Miss Tolan. First thing Bobby Scott, the senior, does, because he lived in a time where he understood, you don't argue when a police got a gun and you black. He says, shut the hell up, get on the ground. That's what he told his son and his cousin. They both did that on the front porch on the ground. Then they put him up, spread eagle. Miss Tolan is protesting. Beautiful former newscaster, Lynx member in Houston, just outstanding family. All of 5'2", and I'm bringing it to an end. But I got to tell you this. Miss Tolan says, you all are making a big mistake. Laura, she said, this is our house. This is our son. This is our car. And the sergeant told her to shut up and get against the wall. She said, you gotta be kidding, are you serious? To what point he grabbed her by the arm and threw her against the garage door. And you know, garage doors are hollow, so it made a lot of noise, and she was very fair-skinned, and it left a bruise on her arm. When Robbie Tolan, on the ground, sees him do this to his mother, he starts to get up and say, get your hands off my mother. And when he does that, the police officer turns and shoots him. And the grand jury indicted the officer. They came back not guilty, filed a federal lawsuit. They dismissed it under qualified immunity. And his mother, God bless her, Marion Tolan, had the faith Laura put up their house, everything, paid all kind of lawyers' fees, appealed it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court when everybody told her she didn't have a snowball chance, and you know where. But she had the faith of a mustard seed, and I stand here, Hillary, as a proud lawyer. So there are certain times when lawyers, we're proud. The U.S. Supreme Court, and y'all know the makeup of our Supreme Court, they came back with a unanimous decision to reverse the Texas federal court saying, no, you got to let them have their day in court. So I say all that to say we got a lot of work to do. It's going to be a long journey. It took from 2008 to 2013 when they were all by themselves. Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, Robbie Tolan, a lot of these families are by themselves. Attorney Briggs and I said the reason we got to be here is this is a national issue, this racial profiling. We cannot look at it as a state issue. So Congressman Scott and Laura, Hillary, we got work to do because this is a national issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney Crump. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming now to the podium Chief John Dixon III.
Wow, after all that, a police officer comes up. First of all, I want to, thank all of you for the opportunity to bring a perspective, a policing perspective to it. I bring several perspectives. I bring a policing perspective, I bring the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement's perspective, and I bring a black male's perspective to it. Racial profiling, we all know is wrong. In policing, we know it's wrong. We know things happen. But what this is about from our point of view, first of all, it's about transparency in organizations. With the thousands of police across the country, there are going to be things that happen. I don't care what profession you have, there are going to be things that happen. What's important here is how you deal with those things when they happen. And I think what we heard from Attorney Crump is a failure to be able to deal with those things when they happen. Nobody's saying they're not going to happen. Nobody's saying that everybody in the profession is going to be honorable and always do the right thing. But we have to, as organizations, we have to, as a society, hold folks, and the next thing is accountable for what they do. It has to be a sense of accountability, and accountability has to be a higher standard. It's unfortunate, that in this profession, people look to you to have that higher standard. Yes, they look to you to be trained enough to respond in those situations accordingly. It's a human piece to that. We all know, we discussed earlier, there's a human piece to that. And that human piece, has to be cultivated by some training because, we have to continue to train our law enforcement officers to be able to respond. Not getting too deep into Ferguson, but you look at the makeup and the demographics of the organization, you look at the makeup and the demographics of the police department. That was a recipe for disaster. Things should have been put in place early on to address those issues. And that's one of the things we as a society, we as a black community, we as law enforcement organizations, we have to get in front of those problems. We got to start looking at what's happening beforehand. We have to look at an organization and say, okay, how should our demographics match the community we serve? And that's a very strong piece. Sometimes that's a difficult conversation for people to have, but it's a real conversation because you have to understand the community that you serve. I talked to a situation that happened in Hampton area some years ago. A church van was driving. The church van got pulled over. It was a holiness church van. And, for those who are familiar with the holiness faith, folks got out speaking in tongues, folks got out, talking, and it scared the officer that was involved because he hadn't seen anything like that. And he was ordering and screaming, and the folks were speaking in tongues and praying and jumping around, and he really lost respect. It was fortunate that a friend of mine who was a supervisor rolled up, and he understood what was going on, so he calmed that situation. Imagine if he wasn't there. Imagine if that situation wasn't calm. Imagine the response that could have happened to a van full of church folks who were simply expressing themselves in the way they express themselves, and had somebody not understanding that perspective showed up. So, that's an important piece, and that's putting things in place beforehand and making sure that, when these things happen, we have proper responses. And I'm going to be brief. One of the things that we also have to do as a community, as a society, and hopefully, this law is the first perspective in that. We have to build in our communities, we have to build in our youth, so we don't have to repair our adults, and so we don't have to repair our society. So keep that in mind. Please support looking at, making sure that this law passes, and anything we can do from the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, we're here to do, and we're here to support. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Chief Dixon. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in bringing to the podium Dr. Philip A. Goff.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Laura, to the ACLU, to the Leadership Conference, Senator Cardin, Congressman Conyers, Congressman Scott, Hillary, the panel, and all of you for being here. I'll make one correction to my bio. I have recently changed my title. I'm now Associate Professor. There is a God. And I am currently at the Harvard Kennedy School. As President of the Center for Policing Equity, we have the opportunity to be deeply tied from the academic side and the practitioner side inside of law enforcement. So I was asked today to come to speak about the scientific perspective on racial profiling. I'll try not to be too complicated in my brief remarks. It's bad and it doesn't work. But more than that, my recommendation as a scientist is to say that we have to stop following tragedy with embarrassment. Let me explain what I mean by that. After after Sean Bell, after Eric Garner, after Michael Brown Jr., the people have stood up. The public have said, we are outraged. We need something better. They look to the leadership to say, what is the plan? We are ready for action. And there has been no plan. The reason there has been no plan is not because individuals and organizations have not been fighting this fight for some time, but because we can't answer basic questions like, how often does it happen? Where does it happen? How bad is the problem? I'll give you an example that makes it a little bit more real for some people, and I'll talk to my chief of staff who loves it when I talk about this. If you have a friend who comes to you and says that they have a money problem, and then they also tell you that they don't have a budget, they're not taking it seriously. That's an embarrassment because they don't have a plan for a problem. If you have a friend who says, I'm planning to drive across country, but they don't have a map and they don't have a GPS, that's embarrassing because they're not taking it seriously and they don't have a plan. We have a racial problem with policing in the United States, and the way we've been approaching it has not been serious because we don't have a plan. We don't even know what the numbers are. So how can we diagnose how bad it is and where we should start to fix it? So I don't want to talk to you about this Ferguson. I want to talk to you about the next one. The Center for Policing Equity works in police departments all over North America and all around the globe. And I will tell you a brief story about something that happened 2.5 years ago. We were going into a police department at the request of chiefs. That's how we operate. Progressive law enforcement brings us in. And the chief said, we're not quite sure what to do with the numbers. I don't know if we're in a good place or in a bad place. I don't know if this is too much, I need to fire everybody, or if we're doing great and we need to celebrate. But I will tell you this, and these words haunted me when I got the first phone call about Ferguson. He said, we are one dead black teenager away from this whole place burning to the ground. The worst part about that story to me is you couldn't possibly tell me what city I'm talking about. Imagine knowing it's coming, knowing that you've got a problem, not having the data, not having the information to try and do the right thing. That's what I mean by following tragedy with embarrassment. We have to stop doing that. That's the purpose of the IRPA, and that's the purpose of the research that we're doing at the Center for Policing Equity. There's a lot of emotion, and I feel like I'm at church on Tuesday morning. Thank you all so very much for that. But I also want to give all the high emotion and the negative feelings, I want to give a positive spin to it, not to the tragedies, but to what can come next. There is good news in this. About 2 years ago, about 6 months after that chief said that to me, we were hosting a convening, co-hosting with the Department of Justice on how to just collect and report racial profiling data. It was a nerd's paradise. I guarantee all of you would have been bored to tears by the first half day. But in the afternoon, something different happened. Two chiefs started getting into it a little bit. One chief said to the other, "You need to stop calling me a racist." And the other chief said, "I will when it stops applying." And I got my popcorn. I said, "This is going to get good." Luckily, they were separated by a table, and there was a picture of the Attorney General on the wall, so no fisticuffs ensued. But by the end of it, the accusing chief threw his hands up. I think it's interesting. You can throw your hands up in surrender. You can throw your hands up in frustration, and he was doing both. And he said, "We have not understood this problem deeply because law enforcement has traditionally been cowardly on this." I want the reporters in the room to understand I'm quoting, not saying. He said that. The chief said that. Said, "We don't want to know how well we stack up against other people because we're afraid we might be on the bottom, but we need to. We need transparency and accountability." And he looked at me and he said, "Hey, Phil, can you guys do that?" It took me about 5 minutes to figure out what he was asking for. And I asked, "Are you looking for an independent national database for racial profiling and police use of force?" And every chief, all 36 in the room, nodded in agreement and said yes. So there is good news. Progressive law enforcement wants national data on this. And we have been, for the past 2 years, putting together the first national database of police stops, pedestrian and vehicle, as well as use of force. Right? We're in the process of fixing the embarrassment, but we need a plan. The way we do analyses right now do not work. If they worked, we would have seen some changes. We'd know where it starts. Right now, what we're doing is basic correlations. And as we all know, correlation does not equal causation. I apologize for slipping into the stats professor role, but it's true. Okay? We need to do better, and we can do better with that. And the good news is chiefs know this. They understand that they are one, I hate to say it again, dead black teenager away from their whole cities burning to the ground. And nobody wants that. So they're asking for us to do better with them. We need to give them the tools to do the right thing, and then we need to have accountability systems set up so that those who aren't can get persuaded. So with that, as a professor, I'll go ahead and stop as early as I can. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Goff. Our final presentation by Attorney Tony Rothard.
Thank you all for having this panel and for inviting me to be a part of it. I come here from Missouri, and I'm invited here because Ferguson happened in the state where I work. And I have some bad news. There's nothing special about the city of Ferguson. There's nothing that special about the Ferguson Police Department. If I were making a list of the dozens, and there are dozens of police departments just within St. Louis County, and I had to guess where Ferguson would have happened, Ferguson would not have been in the top 10. It wouldn't have even been in the top 20. Not just in St. Louis County, but across this country, we have a real problem, a real deterioration in the relationship between police and, in particular, communities of color. Racial profiling is at the root of that problem. It is at the core of the problem. It's not the only part of the problem, but it continues it. It builds the distrust. It makes police departments distrust communities of color, and it makes communities of color distrust the police department. In Missouri, we have a decent racial profiling law. Police departments make reports every year to the Attorney General's office, some basic information, nothing that could prove causation, but enough to show you that there's a real problem. And every year, our Attorney General, Governor Nixon was Attorney General before he was governor, and Attorney General Koster, who will probably be the next governor, you know, every year they come out with a report and they go, gosh, these numbers are getting worse. Something ought to be done about it. And every year the numbers get worse. But every year nothing is done about it. Nothing's done about it. Racial profiling in Missouri, anyhow, is getting worse. And it was just a matter of time before something like Michael Brown being shot happened, and it's just a matter of time before it happens again. There's a lot that happened in Ferguson that is a little surprising to folks. In the aftermath of the shooting, the militarized response and how much military equipment there was there to shut down people exercising their First Amendment rights. The lack of transparency from the police department in telling us what happened, and many of the unexplained questions about what happened that day. They're still unanswered. And the tendency of the police department to when questioned or challenged, to shut down First Amendment rights rather than allowing communities to be heard. It's big in Ferguson because it's public, and there are a lot of people paying attention, and there are a lot of people recording. But these same things are happening on a smaller scale every day in Missouri and across the country. And they're not going to change until we do something to end racial profiling. And at the risk of getting too localized, I'm supposed to bring a localized perspective. I'll give you the perspective from my house. You may not be able to tell from looking at me, but I'm the parent of 2 black teenage sons. And I am afraid for them. I am scared that what happened in Ferguson to Michael Brown and what's happened across this country could happen to them. And it's really hurtful to see so many people unwilling to take these issues seriously. And if anything good can come out of Ferguson, it is that we'll start to end the denial that there's racism and that there's racism in how we police in this country, and start to end the notion that racial profiling is ever okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to go to questions in just a second, but I just want to point out a couple of things as we move ahead. Number one, you probably heard a number of things about many of the challenges of transparency as we talk about issues of racial profiling. I'll be remiss if I didn't mention the Deaths in Custody Act that is now pending before the United States Senate that passed the House of Representatives. For those of you who don't know, in addition to being extremely brilliant and former NAACP branch president, that bill was introduced in the House by Congressman Bobby Scott. Give him another big hand. And he's right. Quite frankly, in order to manage these problems, we must first measure them. So indeed, as we talk about the End Racial Profiling Act, is a tool for measurement, just as the Death in Custody Act is a tool for measurement. Many people, you're probably surprised to know that in no place in our federal government do we have one singular component, a singular deposit unit in which we collect the data on the deaths of those that are at the hands of police officers. From the time they yell stop, as we've seen in the Michael Brown case most recently, to other challenges across the country. So with that, I want to go to questions. I want to make sure and give everybody the opportunity to answer some questions or ask questions while we have just a few minutes before we close out. Are there questions? Don't be shy. I know we got all these Senate staffers sitting in the room and whatnot as well. Why don't we start over here with this gentleman? We're bringing the microphone over to you right now.
I know we've mentioned most of the extreme profiling that usually ends in death, but many times, at least in my experience, because I've been profiled several times before, most times people don't have a defense for just getting pulled over, and then you have a lot of folks who end up going to jail for crimes they didn't even commit because they can afford a lawyer. So profiling begins several layers back, and you have these extreme cases that are the result. I just wanted to get your thoughts on how do we, for individuals who can't afford a lawyer and have a criminal justice system that's not always helpful to individuals who can't afford a lawyer, and they have these plea bargains, and you have people whose lives start out on a bad spot because they couldn't afford a lawyer. How do we deal with profiling on the other end where it starts and it's more abundant?
Very good. I think Dr. Goff raised that if you just push the little red button. Thank you.
So thank you for your question. One of the difficulties of the way that bias and discrimination function today is that people rarely tell you that the reason they're doing something is because they're racist, right? And it sounds kind of ridiculous, but it used to be not too long ago that they would. And without that, you don't have the audit of, would I be treated differently if I were a different color, if I looked a different way? So it's hard to say, given the way that the justice system is slanted against those who don't have, how an individual can fight back. But a community can fight back when we have the information, when we understand that it's not just disproportionate to the people living there, but it's driven by certain policies and certain things in police training. When we have the information for that, that's a system of accountability that can be brought to bear on every department across the United States, and it gives the individual the power of the community to resist when law enforcement is going counter to their values.
Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Ashley Westerman with Capital News Service. I just had a quick question about something specific in IRPA, and it's the right. It creates the right of action for victims of racial profiling, to seek redress. From a legal standpoint, maybe it's just my own ignorance, but from a legal standpoint, how is that different than now? How would that change?
Why don't I ask Attorney Rothert from the ACLU?
Well, right now, there is 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, which is the Civil Rights Act, which allows someone whose constitutional rights have been violated to seek redress in federal court or state court. It's a high standard. There's a defense called qualified immunity that allows a lot of discretion to police officers. Creating a statutory right that goes beyond just the constitutional rights that we all enjoy would give plaintiffs an opportunity to go to court and not have to prove, to prove your constitutional rights were violated, you have to show that no reasonable police officer could have ever done what the police officer did. And that's almost impossible to prove. They're hard cases to win. But if it's a statutory right, not a constitutional right, it's a lower standard, and it puts people who've been victims of racial profiling on a more even footing with the police department.
Thank you very much. I think Attorney Crump also wanted to comment. If you push the little button, Attorney Crump.
I would just add to that, ma'am, that we need legislation because, as Attorney Rother said, the 1983 claims are incredibly difficult. I think I have cases in 24 states with 1983 claims, and I can almost predict what the judges are going to say, qualified immunity. Even in the Tolan case, after he was shot on his front porch, and it was known that the police put the wrong tag number in, he was driving a brand new Nissan SUV. When they found out what car was stolen that he punched in, it was a Nissan Sentra. So nobody could mistake the two and stuff. Even then, the courts said it didn't matter. We think that the police officer acted reasonable because he was in fear of his life. And that's always what they say in qualified immunity cases. And what we did, fortunately, on Tolan case, is they always say you have to put it in context. And they always, Congressman Scott, talk about the context from the vantage point of the police department. And I've been screaming all over America, losing all these cases, because if you're going to try these kind of cases, the laws favor the police. They don't favor the people. And so I kept saying, it's context of the police and the person they shot, and the person they shot, and the person they shot. And you keep saying that, but, it falls on deaf ears. So finally, the Supreme Court has kind of said, you got to put it in context. So maybe that gives us a little hope. But I'm like Attorney Roth, it's very difficult. And I have to say this here really quick. Talking about profiling and it being part of the system, and Attorney Briggs and I, we looked at this. Y'all remember the Bernard Getz case, Laura?
Oh, yeah.
The New York Appellate Court held that additionally, courts around the country have accepted that the race of an individual, and Goff, I thought you'll find this interesting, the race of an individual is relevant evidence in determining the reasonableness of a claim of self-defense. So if you're a black person and the person say self-defense, it's more likely, just like in Trayvon, that the claim, their stand your ground claim or their self-defense claim is allowed. And how can we have this as part of the law, as part of the system, Hillary? But that's what we have.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much. And for those who aren't aware, he's talking about the New York subway vigilante, Bernard Getz, that actually got on trains shooting people, among other things and whatnot. Yes, Bobby Scott.
Ben, could you talk about the difference between the criminal case and the civil case, and what the standards how the standards are different?
Absolutely. And I'm sure Attorney Roth and Laura may have some perspective on this from the ACLU. But, you know, in the Tolan case, I just used that one because that one just seems so blatant to me. He's on his front porch, his mom and dad in their underwear, literally, saying, this is our child, and they came out the house. And still, after the prosecutor doesn't indict, he sends it to a grand jury, i.e. Ferguson. You know, a prosecutor's job is to indict people once they have probable cause. This smoke and mirror that I got to send it to a grand jury is just a play on us. I can tell you this, if the facts were reversed, Hillary, there wouldn't be no grand jury. If Michael Brown shot a police officer or Trayvon Martin shot his killer, they wouldn't be a grand jury. Those are the black boys would be indicted. So it's just a play on words and smoke and mirrors. So when you get the criminal trial, then it's beyond a reasonable doubt. But civil is a reasonable standard. But when it's a police officer, here's where the problem comes in. That 1983, proving a constitutional claim when the laws are so in place to justify all police actions. And what we're seeing in Ferguson, and why we got to stay vigilant, is they are trying to spin this. They are trying to, 7 eyewitnesses, 7, so say he put his hands up. And, you know, I think the other witnesses were just as credible as the construction workers, but now that the construction workers said it, for some reason they say, oh, it must be true, and that's another conversation. But 7 witnesses, broad daylight, execute this kid. So that standard is different. I want to say civil is normally easier, but not with a police officer.
And I would just say another thing about qualified immunity is the judge decides that you're out, your case is over. So there's never a jury that gets to hear the case, and then the facts never come out, and there's no historical record of what's happening in this country because you don't even get to trial. And having this federal law pass would give us an opportunity. You know, it might not win every case, but every case gets heard. There are transcripts, and we know in history what happened.
It would be huge, and I just want to say to Officer Dixon, the young man asked the question, I think always go document it, even when they profile you, and they don't, go down to the police department, and this is what we don't do. Fill out the complaint form, keep a copy for it yourself. Please share it with the NAACP, because what they tell us all the time, Congressman Scott, what y'all talking about racial profiling crime? You just trying to start something. We ain't got no documentation of racial profiling in our community. And I wonder in Ferguson how much documentation they had of racial profiling, because we don't do it. We just be pissed off and then we go home.
No, thank you very much. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we have run out of time. As you can clearly see, there's so much more to be discussed along these lines, but let's take away just a couple things from this. Number one is, if we continue to do things in the same way we've done them, which is exactly what we're doing, it is the clinical definition of insanity. We have to move from insanity to actually addressing the problem. Secondly, in order to manage a problem that is as broad and expansive as this, we must first measure it. So collecting the data and the kind of transparency that's absolutely necessary along these lines to fix this problem is something that the End Racial Profiling Act does, among other things. So let me first thank our panel. Please give them a huge hand. And finally, to close this out, my good friend, the Executive Vice President from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, Ms. Nancy Zirkin.
Thank you, Hillary, and thank all of you. Mr. Scott, Mr. Conyers, who unfortunately is not here, and Senator Cardin for putting this all together. We are grateful because it is very, very important, and thank you, panel. You were wonderful. The panel emphasized the critical need for systemic reform for profiling and to specifically address it. As Mr. Rothert said, profiling is getting worse. In fact, in some places, to me, it looks like it's getting institutionalized for the following reason. In New York, as many of us know, right after Ferguson, a young man was shot. But they have processes in place to handle such things. So instead of fixing the problem, doing a law that works, they are managing it. That's not hopeful to me. And I want to reinforce the need for Congress to pass the End Racial Profiling Act and for the Department of Justice to issue their revised guidelines. As Mr. Goff said, there is no data. There is no strategy without the data, and I am thrilled we all are, you are providing some of that. And while that's great, our government should be providing that. Our government should ban racial profiling, because until that happens, we will continue to see these incidents and racial profiling being managed like they manage homelessness. And that's scary to all of us. And the revised guidance has got to be updated. It has to include eliminating national security. It needs to eliminate profiling in the name of national security, close the loopholes. And I don't know when it's going to happen, but hopefully in the next several years, we will be able to push forward. And I pray to God that there aren't any more Michael Browns or Trayvon Martins. But unless we make it happen, unfortunately, it's not the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nancy Zirkin, and thank you everyone for coming out today.